Happy Spooktober, everyone. So, who's interested in talking about the Nordic living dead? It's time to talk all things Draugr.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Smith, and you are listening to The Wayward Wanderer.
Every culture and form of spirituality in the world has its own stories about what the dead do after they die, the places associated with the dead, and all things morbid. The Nordic peoples, who modern heathens uses our main source for inspiration, were no different, and had their own form of living dead called the Draugr. Now, talking about the Draugr, especially with the month when this episode is going to drop, is more than just talking about something that's cool and kind of spooky. The Draugr reveals something about how these people understood life, death, and the barriers between these two states of existence. One place where listeners have probably first seen a Draugr or reference to the concept of the Draugr is in Robert Eggers' recent film, The Northman. In it, there is a scene where, spoilers, the protagonist, Amleth, has to break into a grave mound to seize a particular sword so he can carry out his vengeance. We then see Amleth duel with a shambling corpse who is seated within the boat that he was buried in, wearing his armor and fighting quite vigorously for his sword. This scene represents something that happens quite frequently in the Icelandic sagas, where the Draugr and the dead are a frequent presence, and there are often stories of things like the heroes of these sagas breaking into burial mounds to reclaim great treasures, or to put an end to a Draugr who is causing harm to the people and the community around them. There is a certain logic to this kind of give and take, and as I'll get into more over the course of this episode, it's perfectly fitting that if we can reach to the dead, not just literally going into the mounds, but also through things like the arts of Seidr and Spaework, then it only makes sense that the dead can reach back. So how I'm going to get into this is first by explaining some more about the significance of death in an animistic culture and from an animistic perspective. Then I'm going to get more specifically into the Draugr and where they exist. After that, I'm going to discuss how you could see the processes of burial as being a way of keeping the dead in the ground, and then sort of wrap things up from there. If you like this episode, my content, and any of the other work that I do, I have a Patreon. $5 a month gets you advanced access to podcasts, and starting this month, a once-a-month live Q&A, and more benefits as the Patreon grows. You can also find me on Twitter at rsmithf_I, Discord, Facebook, and at my website onblackwings.com. When we're talking death and animism, it is important to get away from a lot of assumptions that tend to come in modern society around death and the relationship between the dead and the living. Broadly speaking, three of the biggest influences around how we as a society think about death, at least when you're talking the United States and other places that feel American cultural influence, is from Christianity, the Industrial Revolution, and the spiritualist movement. To get into each one briefly, within Christianity, broad strokes, there is a general idea of that when you die, you are subject to judgment, originally in the Bible and in a lot of pre-modern theology. This was something that would happen on the Day of Judgment at the end of the book of Revelations, which is the one with the seven-headed beast and the Whore of Babylon and all the other really like kind of Michael Bay special effects. This is the moment where those who are not on God's side get cast into the lake of fire, and those who are on the side of God get to go be in paradise forever. This has sort of developed over time to this sort of popular Christianity take of where you face that judgment after you die, and you're either rewarded by going to heaven or you are punished by going to hell. Without getting into the Old Testament, because there isn't much in the way of people talking to dead people, bringing the dead back, and generally speaking, Christian practice developed a number of different prohibitions against doing anything that was seen as necromancy or black magic. This is stuff that people end up being persecuted over for several hundred years. Even today, there is quite a bit of skepticism and opposition within more evangelical and conservative elements of Christianity to anything that looks like necromancy or talking to the dead. So it's safe to say the general idea around life and death there is that this is an impermeable membrane. The only way to break this is to defy God's law and do something that is unnatural or supernatural, even though there is lots of practice of things like praying for the souls of the dead and veneration of saints, which, you know, in the case of like Christian denominations who do that, things get really fuzzy there. The point is, the general theme is one of separation between the two. The Industrial Revolution adds a new twist on this existing assumption, particularly because it's coming out of these Christian societies that are already predisposed towards seeing a strong sense of separation between life and death. Things like medical science have now progressed enough that doctors can fairly reliably start getting an idea of what happens to people's bodies and what is going on that shows proof of death. And I want to stress, like, the floor that we're talking about here for making sure that people are dead at the beginning of, like, say, the Victorian period in the 1800s is in the form of this thing called graveyard bells, which were basically these bells that you could have installed for your loved one that came with a rope that ran down into your casket so that in case they were wrong and you weren't actually dead, you could ring on the bell and hope that somebody would come and dig you up. When your starting point is creepy-ass bells in graveyards that are rung by potentially buried alive people, there is a lot of room for improvement, and being able to consistently go, hey, people are dead, is a nice thing. And when it's coming in this broader paradigm of not just Christianity, but also the kind of active cultural and very real imperialism that was going on in the world, which included the suppression and destruction of indigenous spiritualities who had more permeable views of life and death, it becomes easy to see how you get this larger concept of life and death being these hard, separate things, and never the twain shall meet. Though it is interesting to point out that this is also when you get some great stuff in popular literature, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which, it must be said, invented modern horror and science fiction in one go. Like, give it a read sometime. It's basically the 19th century version of a found footage Blair Witch style movie. And more importantly, for the purposes of this conversation, the spiritualist movement. I talk a little bit about the spiritualist movement in the history appendix of my book. If you want more information on the spiritualist movement, I highly recommend Jamie Loftus's Ghost Church podcast, which explores both the past and present of the spiritualist movement. The short version is spiritualism is one of the forerunners of a lot of the New Age movement and a lot of the groups that would go on to start modern paganism. They believe that after death, ghosts still hang around and are present in people's lives, and it is possible to interact with and communicate with the dead through the use of spiritualist mediums. If this is stuff that sounds vaguely familiar, that's because a lot of the core ideas about how the spiritualist movement views and understands the dead and death has permeated into the rest of society through pop cultural osmosis. You've probably seen at least a few movies or TV series, whatever medium you prefer, where there is some kind of psychic medium, where there's ghosts that are hanging around and talking with people. This is all stuff that comes out of the spiritualist movement and has seeped into broader culture. If somebody asks, do you believe in ghosts? They're probably referring to something in this line of thinking. What's really important to get into about the spiritualists here is they are also developing as a reaction against the Industrial Revolution, and as well as something for helping people cope with often difficult times or periods of great trauma. You see, for example, huge surges of interest in the spiritualist movement after the end of the American Civil War, which remains the bloodiest war ever fought on North American soil to date. And the First World War, which was, at the time, the bloodiest war in human history. There was a lot of stuff that came out of spiritualism around scientifically proving all of this, and that's where you see things like ghost hunters and people going around with EMP meters and stuff. This is all stuff that is bound up in modernity, coming through what is initially a strongly Christian-influenced lens. When we're talking about heathen practice, different forms of animistic practice, and other kinds of pagan practice, a lot of these assumptions just don't really work. And that's especially true when we're talking about Draugr. Now, generally speaking, when you are looking at heathen practices or other pagan practices, there is much more of a view that the barrier between life and death is a permeable membrane. And the transition from life to death is a change of state. It is a different form of existing within reality. This does not put the deceased or the living in separate places, but rather in a different kind of relationship with each other. The dead are dead, but particularly in heathenry, we are still in relationship with them, both through the orlog that they laid down through their existence, through the luck that they may have passed on to us, and through how we understand them as human beings and what that means for us now. This continuous relationship is expressed in different forms of ancestor veneration and other related practices which have antecedents among the pre-conversion Nordic peoples, who are described as engaging in practices like leaving offerings at great burial mounds for those who are interred within. This whole concept of continuous relationship is one that I think folks who are either coming from a culturally Christian background or from a more secular outlook may have difficulty engaging with and wrapping their heads around. And that's because the whole conversation that has existed around things like ghosts and is there an afterlife or not hinges on whether or not it is something that is true and provable, at the exclusion of all other possibilities. From the more Christian-influenced perspective, either heaven and hell are true or they are not true. And if they are not true, then that raises lots of other questions and problems for Christianity, and that has to be the exclusive way it works. Even when you throw in stuff like purgatory, there is still essentially no other option than you go to one of these 3 particular pre-assigned destinations, either on Judgment Day or at the moment of your death. Any other form of death, afterlife, or interacting with the dead opens the possibility of something different being out there, and that doesn't work when your theology explicitly says we are the way and the truth and the light, and this is the only way. So the conversation comes to hinge on proof, because proof is really important when you are claiming exclusive truth. This is also why I think you see a tendency in other approaches to these whole questions, at least when you're talking with an American and American-influenced parts of the world, towards demanding truth and proof in terms that they can understand. This was even something within spiritualism, and you still see it with things like ghost hunters. But again, it assumes that these are things that must be proven as true to be valid. And that truth specifically means either some kind of measurable outcome within the bounds and confines of what currently exists in terms of available technology, or some kind of profound theological or metaphysical truth. That does not apply when we're talking about these more porous animistic understandings of death. Even though, as I'm going to get into in a bit, there is a lot of stuff in the surviving folklore that suggests the ancients saw the Draugr and other similar forms of living dead as very real. Does not mean we have to see it in the exact same way. And more importantly, what matters when we're talking about this is what it shows about how the dead are approached. That they aren't just deceased, gone, that's all there is to it, but that we are in relationship with those who have gone before us. The consequences of their actions and how they influence the world around us matters. And having this kind of terminating, that's it, they're gone kind of approach to the dead and those who have gone before us cuts off this conversation and this relationship. It's also something that I think makes a certain kind of intuitive sense. Anyone who has ever gone by the graveside or memorial for a loved one and laid down a wreath or a bouquet of flowers or some kind of token, and maybe said some words or been in conversation with them, has been kind of doing a form of this, of having something like that kind of relationship with the dead. They don't need to physically get up, walk around, and cast blights upon the landscape for this whole idea of being in relationship with those who've gone before us to have validity and worth all its own. All that said, these stories and the idea of the Draugr is still pretty cool and would make for a great horror movie if someone ever wanted to do something just about Draugr. And talking about stuff like that is fun. Scaring ourselves with stories of the angry dead coming back to wreak vengeance upon the living is fun. And I think that by itself is a good enough reason for getting into these stories, while keeping in mind the broader assumptions about reality that they represent. So let's get into the Draugr. Source material and scholarship describes them as what we would call living corpses. They are the Hammer taking on a life of its own after what we often conventionally define as death. Draugr are described as living in a similar way to how they once did in life, but within the mounds where they are buried, with many descriptions in sagas like the Eyrbyggja saga and Grettir saga of Draugr feasting and celebrating within the halls that were made of their final resting place. They are usually described as having a deathly pallor about them, and that when they are struck by weapons, they do not bleed, which is the telltale sign of showing that something is a Draugr. They could be described as having swollen to enormous size and possessing strength great enough to crush full-grown people in a single blow. Draugr also retain much of their intelligence and knowledge of their former life, which can include knowledge of save and other mystical arts. There are examples in the Eyrbyggja saga and the Laxdæla saga of Draugr taking on different shapes. Though, like their corpse forms, these do not appear normal. We're talking some, kind of Silent Hill stuff like flayed bulls. Some are even said to be able to move through the earth as if they were swimming through it like water. Some are said to be able to blight crops and haunt whole communities, bringing death, ruin, and decay within their wake. Draugr are always closely associated with the burial mounds that they are interred within upon death. And much like is the case in many other stories of horror and the supernatural in popular culture, tend to come after those who disturb them within their graves. Though it is said in some sources that there are Draugr who also come back specifically because of envy or some kind of desire for vengeance against the living. Like I said at the top of the podcast, if you ever wanted to do a horror story featuring a Draugr, there would be so much to work with and a lot that you could play with. Draugr are also sometimes referred to as Opterganger, which literally means aftergoer, or one who walks after death, if you want a more poetic translation of the term. Some of what comes up in these stories about Draugr fits with what anthropologists and other scholars have observed in cultures around the world, of where different otherworldly or unusual kind of beings, often the unquiet dead, are blamed for causing misfortune for the living, particularly things like outbreaks of disease and other fun stuff like that. Now, if you're talking a pre-invention of germ theory society who is operating on other ways of understanding the way disease spreads, it makes a certain amount of sense to look at least these aspects of Draugr stories as a way of explaining away instances like sudden outbreaks of disease, which is a thing that's regularly recorded in the different sagas. Like, there's absolutely some instances where you'll see an entry that is going along and describing a particular family and what's happening to them, and then you get a notation of, and then a whole bunch of people died of plague that winter, or something similar to that. When you have ideas about relationships with the dead that see things as sort of a two-way street, of that while we can interact with the dead, they can still interact with us in different ways, it makes some sense to attribute moments like this to the unquiet or angry dead. This especially makes sense if somebody has been doing something like, say, poking around in a grave mound and messing with a corpse, because even though, you don't have things like germ theory and an understanding of how disease is passed around and moves from person to person, we know from a modern sense that, rotting bodies are a gigantic biohazard and are generally not safe for your health or not catching diseases and all that other fun stuff to be around. In this way, it makes a certain amount of sense that the Nordic peoples would directly attribute spread of disease in particular to the Draugr, because yeah, that is a great way to get yourself sick, is to poke around with a dead body and see what happens. That said, focusing too much on this end of explanation, which is something you tend to see a lot in modern society, of describing gods and myths and folklore as a way of describing things that quote-unquote primitive peoples could not understand, misses out on what else is being expressed in these stories and what else is going on, of how this is a different relationship to the dead. This is a different understanding of what happens to people after they die. And it's one that's very different from the much more final and definite, as well as strongly separated sense that you get from Christianity and Christian-influenced concepts of life and death. There is also a certain beauty in the underlying assumption of death as a change of state and a change of how you exist in the world, and not necessarily an end to who you are. That said, there is also something that is interesting about the folklore and saga and other examples around Draugr and the way that the dead were interred within the Nordic world. I am speaking, of course, of the practices that could be best described as making sure the dead stay dead. Archaeologically speaking, we have a lot of interesting evidence that shows keeping dead people in the earth and interred was an important part of funerary and burial customs for the Nordic peoples. One custom related to that, which is one that's attested to in several different sources and sagas, is what's referred to as the corpse door, which is where a family who had recently had someone pass away would have a specific door basically cut out of a wall or somewhere else that was not the usual way for going in and out, that they would then bring the deceased body out of the home and away for burial. The idea behind this seems to be that the dead can only go one way through any particular kind of passage, and the idea behind corpse doors seems to be that the dead can only return by a way that they know. Some sources even describe taking the dead out feet first, specifically so that they would have a hard time seeing what way they left the home by and where the entrance was, which was also further aided, again, by bricking over or covering up the corpse door so that the door that the dead had left through no longer exists. There's also archaeological evidence of specific seals that were placed within graves, such as, for example, the Nornera runestone, which seems to have on it a grave-binding inscription. Basically, an additional protection against the possibility of the dead coming loose from their graves. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, well, what happens if you do have a Draugr running around? And in the stories, the answer is usually pretty consistent and boils down to you hack it to pieces, light it on fire, and make sure that the dead dies even harder this time around. Even though there's examples of spells that seem to have the power to raise and return the dead into their mounds, when they're dead like Draugr on the loose and running amok, the only thing that works for sure is not magic, but a whole lot of very carefully applied violence to the body in question. In case you think this is something that's particularly unusual, this concern for keeping the dead in the ground, and unique to the Nordic peoples, you may be surprised to find that a lot of funerary customs in many different parts of the world involve an element of, let's make sure this dead body stays dead and doesn't come back. Generally speaking, you could probably attribute at least part of that to the imperfect medical knowledge and ability to verify death in all circumstances. Remember that reference to the Victorian casket bells? You know, that's not a new problem for human societies of making sure, wait, is this guy actually a corpse or is something else going on? More specifically, when we get into European folklores, there's a lot of stuff that survives well after various regions convert to Christianity that shows that this is not a thing that's unique to the Nordic parts of the world, but that many of these other stories about walking dead that exist throughout Europe share a common theme of this is somebody who was buried wrong or not properly put in the earth and kept down there. There's examples that come from places like the Balkans of burial customs where a body that was suspected of being a vampire or a person who was suspected of being a vampire would be buried with a sickle over their neck so that if they should rise again, there goes their head. And lots of other similar folkloric customs and practices show up all over the place. The further you get away from church-sanctioned ritual, burial, and funeral within Europe, the closer you get to these rich veins of folklore and story where a major concern for the ordinary person when it comes to life, death, and the hereafter wasn't so much the judgment that awaits you on the other side as it was making sure the recently departed stayed departed. What makes that even more fun in the Nordic context is even though the person has died, their Draugr or their Draugr might still be hanging out in the mound, holding spectral feasts with the morbid attendees who wait on the departed within their mansions of death. Some places, like, say, the great burial mounds at Uppsala, which, based on archaeological excavations, were in use by the year 1000 for at least as long and continuously as the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. You could imagine less a series of individual dwellings and more a great manse filled with many different dead. Something like a multi-generational Viking-themed haunted mansion. But of course, way less Disney. After all, I don't think they'll be doing anything that looks corpse blue and walking around in the shape of a flayed bull whose existence defies all logic and reality. So, to sum up this Spooktober special, the Draugr are a particular kind of living dead that you find in Nordic lore that reflects a whole lot more about how these peoples understood life, death, and passing beyond this existence into another form of existence. Draugr fit neatly within a worldview where it is possible for the living and the dead to still be in relationship with one another, and potentially for those dead, if they are so displeased, to reach from beyond the grave and do something about it. Even though there's quite a bit from the stories of Draugr that do fit well within the explanation of this is people trying to understand something that at that time was beyond their understanding of the world, there is still merit, wisdom, and value in studying these particular stories and what they say about these peoples and their understanding of death, and what this also suggests for modern heathen practitioners. Besides, who doesn't like a good, scary story now and then? Maybe sometimes the best way to deal with that morbid reality that we all grapple with, of the shortness of our own existence and the mystery of what lies beyond, with a good little scare. Have a happy spooky season, everyone. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow me at my website on blackwings.com. Head on over to my Patreon at patreon.com/waywardwanderer. Throwing in a $5 gets you advanced access to this content and more. This has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, signing off.